think best represents them. So, Christian, begin.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Christian Gillot. I'm the founder and CEO of Tetrao. We are an AI startup tech in Luxembourg. And what are we doing? Well, we are working on investment funds. We are collecting daily data from more than 40,000 funds, and we analyze every single document they produce deeply in order to give the data that all the industry needs in an agile way. And since you're asking about a book, I'm going out of financial technology. My favorite book is Anna Karenina. You may have seen the movie, but if you didn't read the book, it's really beautiful, and I recommend it to you.
That's nice. Kunal.
Good recommendation. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Kunal Kapoor. I'm Morningstar CEO. Happy to be here. And, obviously Morningstar is well known for being involved in gathering fund data, but over the past decade, Morningstar has moved well beyond that too. We own PitchBook, which collects private equity and venture cap data. We're in the credit ratings business. So anything got to do with investors' portfolio, we try to think about how we can illuminate that portfolio and empower the investor to make the decisions that they need to be successful. Lots of good books to recommend. Maybe at a Fintech conference, I'll keep your theme going. Maybe at a Fintech conference, this is not what people are looking for, but anything related to Warren Buffett, I always think is, worth reading. Catherine Graham's Personal History is one of my favorite books, if you haven't read it. Really a great story. And I'm in the middle of a good book, which is by no means my favorite book, but I think a good fun book to read. It's called The Last Days of Night, and it's about the race to electrify New York. And it actually harkens back to a time when people didn't trust electricity. And electricity was probably considered tech back in those days. So it's kind of a good lesson when you think about fintech and tech in general, that oftentimes when new things are bought out, there's such a pushback against it. And this book is about how there's so much pushback against electricity.
Here we are. Sjoerd.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sjoerd Leemhuis. I'm founder and CEO of Owlin. With Owlin, we shape a better informed world. So we look at news articles all over the world, 3 million news sources, but also at market reports, research reports, annual reports. And then we apply natural language processing to highlight trends that we see in the market and also the risks that we see in the market. That way we help risk managers and portfolio managers being alerted in time when stuff happens and also make better informed decisions. I think I'll go, instead for a book, I'll go for a piece of music, I think. Because apart from an entrepreneur, I also like to play the piano. And my favorite pianist is Chopin. He's actually, of course, from France. One of the pieces I like best is Fantasie Impromptu. It has a very rough start, and then a very romantic middle end, and then a rough ending again. It represents a bit the entrepreneurial landscape, I think, and also the personality you need to survive in that landscape. Yeah.
Very good. Go.
If you play that, you're an extraordinary pianist. So, hi, everybody. My name is Sébastien, Fiaux. I'm the CEO of SFJ Technologies. We're based in New York. We're what we like to call a fintech for fundamentals. So we produce research tools for investors on particular topics that are linked to the management of risks that are difficult to apprehend or analyze, and where data science can really give research analysts and portfolio managers an edge. So people who actually do fundamental research, we're not trying to replace them, we're trying to give them tools. So we like to see ourselves as the bionic arm of the analysts. And we have a few topics that are live and used by clients today. Our flagship is focused on accounting risk. So the risk of aggressive accounting and let's say creative practices from CFOs into any type of corporate risk is our flagship product. And we also have a suite of ESG analytical tools along the same lines that help researchers. So that's what we do. I guess I'll go for a book as well. I highly recommend, because I think it's one of the most extraordinary novels that I've ever read, and it's just not broadly recognized as such. It's called A Confederacy of Dunces by John Kennedy Toole, and the history is a little bit tragic, but it's a very funny book. But the author thought he was a failed author, and he killed himself. And his mother was relentless, bringing his manuscript to one of the greatest publishers in New York. And ultimately, he reluctantly read the manuscript because he was harassed by this mother, and he couldn't let it go. And it was published, and it became a Pulitzer Prize. And I highly recommend it. So, there you go.
Well, here's for relentless mothers. Okay, so I just want to begin this panel by sort of level setting market news. That is such a broad category. Maybe we can begin down with Sébastien. What is market news? What is it comprised of, and how should people be thinking of market news?
Well, market news, I mean, it's always been around. I think there's a lot of work that's been done, and we've worked on it as well. What I think one of the most pregnant challenges with market news is that it's very noisy. And there's a lot of there are two things. The first thing is, if you believe a little bit in the in some form of it, the efficiency of markets, it's very hard to develop an edge with market news. So that's challenge number one, because the price will tend to reflect the news very, very quickly. So to develop like an edge on whatever the news is, some people are like, oh, let's grab every single blog, and then, you know, within these blog, we'll find this information. I'm like, yes, but probably that's what the market is here for, is to have thousands and thousands and millions of people who look at every single blog every day. You don't need a machine to do that. They do it, and they reflect it in prices right away. So identifying things, that's a very, very big challenge, I think, for technology to solve. I don't think it's unsolvable. On our side, we haven't found in what we do as much predictive ability in market news as we have in more direct fundamental data from companies themselves. And that's already a very broad array of things as to what companies report, but also I think what CEOs and CFOs are going to say on earnings calls. We find this to be a lot more informative and directly informative than the news themselves. But again, we're not specialists of the news business. But I find this to be a challenge that whomever can solve that today is solving a big problem for all that's shared by all investors.
Sjoerd, what is market news?
Yeah, it's a broad definition, right? And I think it started off with, in the past, there might have been a lack of information, so people relied on on news feeds from the big corporations. I think what we have seen changing over the years right now is that everyone can be a reporter. News comes from everywhere, and there's not a lack of information anymore, but everything is out there. But it's really hard to figure out what is relevant for you and what's relevant for the market. So I think what's market news? I think we know the size is increasing, so the data is getting more and more and more. And when it's really market news, it's probably when it might impact your portfolio or the real markets, right? So when it connects to the real world, I would say it will meet up to the criteria.
Kunal, so being the sort of elder statesman from Morningstar here, the legacy, what is market news to Morningstar?
Well, first of all, thanks for calling me an elder statesman. That's the first time in my life anyone's done that for me, so good thing. Look, I think...
But you still look like a little boy.
Sebastian's right. Part of the challenge is there's a lot of noise out there. And so market news, by definition, I think is unhelpful, right? And it's partly unhelpful, I think, because from an investor standpoint, is it really helping you solve a problem that you're trying to solve? And the answer is no. And I think what's interesting about your question is you can extend it to news in general.
Yes.
And if you look at what's happening in social media and basically tech and the intersection of news, there is a ton of noise around whether the information is useful and contextualized in the way people think it is. And so what you have is this massive echo chamber, right? And so I think financial news is like that too. People tend to gravitate to the stuff that they think is right. So Tesla is now a $100 billion company. and larger than Volkswagen, for example. And I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and the person really believed this thesis, and the only news they could point to around it was news that actually confirmed their bias already, that this made sense. And so I think that's market news, and the challenge and opportunity with technology is how do you actually make it not only relevant but useful to the outcome that the investor is trying to get to. And so whether that is, layering it with sort of behavioral technology that helps people actually control for their biases, or being a little bit more prescriptive in terms of ensuring that people don't just see things that are within their echo chamber, the news can be made a lot less noisy. And I think that's the opportunity for firms today.
Okay. Christian?
So I'll take a broader definition of news. It's any kind of information that is published is relevant. And most of the news is actually not read. Most of the information is actually not read. And so where the technology helps is really in the exhaustivity. You can actually create technology that will review everything and make people focus on the right place, like Sébastien was saying just before. Still, we are at a very early stage in digital transformation. At Tetrao, we did a study with PwC Luxembourg about the use of social media by the asset managers. And what we actually saw is that there were some early adopters, but most of the asset managers were doing almost nothing. And that's now. So here, I think it's very important that we think of the future, because those things that we can actually do, they are going to happen. And so what are the consequences and how to adapt and how to take advantage? That's, I think, what we need to answer all together.
So let's dig deeper into social media. That's something I'm very interested in. And then who's generating the news? We touched on those topics a little bit. So Sjoerd, you mentioned who's the reporter, right? Everyone's a reporter. Everybody here with their smartphone is reporting on this panel now, for example. So how do we understand the fact that everyone's a reporter and social media really amplifies people almost equally sometimes who shouldn't have a voice in that conversation?
No, I think you're definitely right. So everyone is a reporter, not everyone is a specialist, right?
Yes.
Or an expert on the subject matter, and that's
Yes.
a big difference. But I think Kunal already mentioned that sometimes information is a big echo chamber, right? Social media can be that too. It is actually interesting to know how big is that chamber, how many people are talking about this. Because if you know if certain news items are being picked up worldwide or only very locally, or if also like the broader recognized news sources are picking it up as well, then you might want to treat it differently. So I think what this whole world has generated, if you have so many people contributing and so many people like providing data and news, you actually get a whole new dimension, which is maybe even the meta news, which is about, okay, is this big, is this small, is this positive, negative, what topic is this about, how does this relate to like a time window of last couple of months. And I think if you manage to tackle that problem, then you can also give meaning to people that are posting stories, and whether it gets big or small.
I tend to agree with this, and just to add to the complexity, maybe an example is interesting to look at. In the markets, and I guess that may be true with other topics, but particularly in the markets, the news, and the problem with the echo chamber, because then you're like, okay, well, let's try to find a tool that's going to distinguish what's an echo chamber and obviously wrong or fake news, and what's the real news.
Fake news was mentioned, but
there you go, bingo. And so the idea is say, okay, well, let's try to figure it out. The problem is in the market very often. Doesn't matter whether it's an echo chamber or not, because the news become the reality. Think about a firm that needs refinancing, yes. And there's a rumor, and then the rumor amplifies, and everybody thinks about it, and they're not going to find financing. The rates are going to go up, and they're not going to be able to refinance, and all of a sudden they're going to default. And they wouldn't have defaulted if there hadn't been this echo chamber, but does it matter? No. The reality is they didn't refinance. So the news can become, and a market crash is like an amplified version of this. Yeah. And so you can see that, you know, that's the difficulty, is that you're going to run into things, you're running into a world where the news, whether real or not, founded or not, because it's the prices are a product of what investors think at a given moment in time, are going to have consequences right away. And it's very hard. That for me is one of the key points that makes it a very difficult topic.
Kunal, you want to weigh in? Who's making the news besides Morningstar? And how does social media play into this amplification?
Well, I think one of the interesting points to make is that a lot of companies have taken kind of a passive approach to social media because there's sort of a feeling that you can employ your traditional strategy, which is that if you're not in the news, it's fine, and you only respond in a very slow way,
yes,
and only if you need to. You know, on social media, the opposite's true. If you engage and you get your followers, I think the brand loyalty can really start to amplify. And you've seen the creation of a lot of interesting consumer brands, for instance, that use social media. And so one of the challenges with consumer brands, as all of you know, is it's really expensive to build a consumer brand. And lots of people have tried in Fintech, you know, the so-called robo-advisors when they first came out, and there were a lot of them here in Europe as well. People were excited about it, but I think everyone underestimated what it actually cost to reach a consumer. And so you were seeing, you know, CAC numbers that were just completely out of control, where the acquisition cost had nothing to do with the reality of what you were actually making from the customer. And social media is actually an opportunity in this regard, because it can significantly, if you do it well and speak to consumers in a certain way, change your acquisition costs. And you know, for example, one of the things we found is social media is highly effective at engaging with people on topics that they're not as well versed on. So if you keep trying to engage with them on topics that they already know, they're not going to respond. Or if they are, it's going to be very low engagement. But if you really want deep engagement, you've got to find a way to engage with them completely differently. It's super fascinating, but within our PitchBook group, the highest lead conversions come over Instagram, which you would never have thought for a professional service that would work, but it does, because people go there and the private markets are not something that people have figured out as yet, and so there's very little content on it, and if you can provide it, people gravitate to it. So there's a lesson there to be learned about what you're putting out and who's putting it out and how you respond to things in general.
Morningstar has made a huge investment in social media and in putting content out. Definitely in a very nascent industry where everyone's really run away from social media. Also regarding Instagram, I think that's a really important point too. The idea of putting out charts and things more visual, yep, you know, benefits an
That's
Instagram
right.
platform.
I mean, all the stuff we've been talking about, the echo chambers, things like that, what gets in front of it is when you can take design principles,
Yes,
marry it with financial technology, and put it in front of a consumer in a way that they can understand it, right? Whether it's a rating, whether it's a complex thing such as an ESG score. Mm-hmm. You walk up to the average consumer and say, like, here's the ESG score for your portfolio. They don't get that.
Yep.
But if you can take a graphic and put it in a way that they can actually consume it, it changes their engagement with something like that.
Absolutely. Christian? And social media and who's generating the news?
So the social media is also very dangerous because it can quickly backfire if your message is not consistent with what your company does. And it also, just going on to what was being said by Kunal, generally language is becoming more and more visual. And so there were a lot of AI companies that were working just on NLP, understanding the language. And one of the trends that we have to deal with, all of the market, is that we have to understand everything which is visual. So the graph, the charts, the photos, because this is the way people communicate more and more. If you can't have total understanding if you don't take into account the emoji, even for professional services.
Yes. Yes, no, that's true. All right, pivoting a little bit here, because we're talking about the news and media. That's certainly changed a lot with paid versus free media versus where you're getting your information from. I'm just curious for this panel, how do you sort of see that competition between what's available in the marketplace for free, what maybe news channels are putting out, what bloggers are putting out, what paid services are putting out? How do all those things sort of create an ecosystem, and how can people figure out what to do there? Christian?
Yes, so that's a very interesting question, April. I think we are about to notice a very big disruption, because today we have many actors that are centralizing information, and the publisher has to pay for the distribution. With the technology being developed, this may very well being gone totally, just like that. I mean, if I can get your info, you don't have to do effort. It just becomes so easy. You just do it this way. Also, the interesting property about that, which is fundamental, is the long tail. So we have a lot of focus on the big actors that are using all the best tools, and they have a lot of visibility. But the power of technology and everything that is coming now is that since it's easier and cheaper to get the information market-wide, then it becomes possible for a small, nimble actor to actually get noticed.
Yes, no, 100%. Kunal?
Yeah, I mean, technology is changing the ability to gather more data faster. But you asked the question just around free versus premium, and I would just say that there's no such thing as a free lunch. And one of the mistakes in fintech models that I see is that everyone sort of starts thinking you can get out there and offer something at no cost. At some point, you got to monetize what you're doing. And so, I mean, I think there's still a distinct difference, generally speaking, if you're talking just about the news in particular, around free and paid. And even when there's free, there tend to be some types of conflicts on monetization models, even on simple blogs, right? You're giving your information up, you're being advertised to, there's some kind of transaction taking place, even if you think it's free. And so you can't forget that aspect of it. So, I'm a believer that like more will become available, and that those who are charging will continue to need to raise their game. But I don't think that premium sources are going to go away, to the extent that premium sources have faltered. And really, I think what we're talking about is like traditional newspapers, for example, have faltered. It's because their business models never allowed them to adapt, right? They were based on classified ads and things like that, and Google came along and owned that.
Yeah.
And so you have to have a real value proposition that goes over and above that.
Let me throw out one other question to you, just around that. I'm just going to mention the term sponsored content, right, as being sort of a hybrid. I'm not, and can investors really distinguish between all of those pieces of content when they're reading the news? I find a lot of the media, when you start looking at the homepage, it's really difficult to tell what content is what.
Yeah, and I think that just goes back to making sure when you're consuming your news that you're doing it from a source that you trust or that has actually disclosed what its policies are. You're right, sponsored content is all over the place. And I think the people who do it right usually do use old school media rules around how you put sponsored content up. But otherwise, there's a lot of people trying to slip it past you, so you do need to kind of...
Yeah, Sébastien, you want to weigh in? Sometimes on one homepage, there's all three of those models. I find it difficult myself to figure out what's what.
No, you're right, and I tend to think that's not the right model.
Yeah.
But I tend to agree with what Kunal just said about, and to your question about premium. For me, there is premium is what I find in our business is that premium is most of the time totally worth it, and the difference is massive in quality, and the reason is easy to understand. Goes back to almost like capitalism works. So if they're successful,
You can say it louder.
oh, I said yeah. Okay, is this working? Okay, capitalism works. And so, if there's a very successful paid service, they're successful for a reason, and because they've been able to survive in a world that's inundated with news. where there's a tremendous pressure on cost, and so you can count on the fact that the survivorship bias is working in this case, and certainly in financial news I've been able to see that's the case in many different examples. There's a service that we were very close to at some point. I won't mention their name, but people can find out by themselves. But they look at the world of distress and bankruptcy. They're a specialized service, and they charge a lot of money to their subscribers. But the added value is tremendous. It has nothing to do with even on topics. And there's another service that we ran into, and we talked to a little bit that was focusing on a number of companies that commit fraud, which is kind of things that we tend to focus on our end. And even on things that have been very well covered, very well publicized, such as, for example, the Under Armour situation and the SEC investigation that was conducted started back in 2017 on the name. These specialized publications had information in there that would have allowed investors to see that coming. That was nowhere to be found, connecting some dots, just doing more work. They had better people, and they had a better focus. So for me, it's very clear for me today that premium information on specialized topics has a lot to offer, and that people who have an established presence in this market today, by and large, deserve it.
Okay, Sjoerd, you want to jump in?
No, I think I agree. So I think the dynamics is extremely interesting, right? A lot of new business models coming up, combinations of business models on one website. That's interesting. But I think they all will survive. So I think we'll have a mix of because there's a business case to pay for premium content. There's also a business case to look at all the content that you're missing to catch also a bit more the long tail of information. So I think still, although that might be harder to monetize on, there will always be new folks that try. There will always be information available. So I think in ideal mix, you realize what type of information you're using for what type of use cases. And I think that's really important, because then you I think if you track, for instance, if you track the biggest listed companies in the world, you might not be interested in tracking the long tail of free media sources, but then you already have enough information if you just follow the big names. But if you focus on more niche players out there in the market, if you're in payments and you're responsible for tracking all your merchants, then it's actually pretty important to cover all these niche sources, because then you don't have access. The big news blogs, they don't write about all the small entities in this world, right? So then for that specific use case, you want to take a different approach. So it all comes down to what you want from the information you need. And I really believe they all will exist in the future next to each other.
No, I mean, I think it's interesting. You're sort of hearing here just somewhat of a bifurcation in terms of the models that can work. So, in financial services today, there's a deep belief that you have to scale to a certain level to be successful. And I think what you're hearing here, and maybe the point Sébastien was making, is you can specialize or you need to be scaled, but you can't really be in the middle, which is kind of interesting.
Well, since we're here at Paris FinTech Forum, we've only touched a little bit on technology. So the last question I want to talk about is AI and news. So there's a couple of different aspects to talk about. One would be AI generating news. And the other one is, how can AI help us consume news and consume data? Do you want to start with that, Christian?
Yeah, sure. That's our core business, so I can talk a long time about it. So, yeah, you're the boss. Anyway, no, so as I was saying, a very important trend is to go into the visuals, understanding of the visuals, what they mean, and so on. The main, the most expensive thing that we have to save is the human time. And so what is really interesting with AI is that you can review huge volume of news information in order to then focus on the interesting part. And it's, so you have two kind of questions. You have the market research, where you have broad broad inquiries to do. But what is very difficult and expensive to do is when you have specific questions, yes or no. Is there an ACG policy? Yes or no? Is there a trend to do something like that? Yes or no? And so that's all the ability of AI. It's deflation. The cost of doing that today is hugely expensive. Refinitiv just announced that they are going to do an effort of standardization on ESG and the data points that we want all the industry to follow. It's going to take years. But with an AI-based approach, you can have something more coarse, but broad and fast. So it's not, and I go on to what you were saying, it's different business models. The two things are interesting and the two things must be done. But it's still new. I mean, we are talking about it now like it's reality. I still think we are bringing that, and that 5 years from now, things are going to be very different.
As the people consume the news. Kunal, what about AI? How does
Yeah, I mean, so maybe I'll take a slightly different angle here. In the hallway, you were saying that wealth management is an industry that has probably progressed the least on technology. You said some version of that to me earlier.
Yes.
And so let's think about how most individuals actually become investors. And many in Europe become investors by partnering with a wealth manager of some kind. And you know, so when we talk about AI, we talk about it in the context of like a business, but how should we think about it in the context of the investor outcome? And I think there's a huge opportunity in wealth management for AI to play a role, including with the news. So let's take a piece of news. Let's say something comes out on a particular day. Today, if you're a wealth manager, you're kind of in that echo chamber with everybody else, and maybe, you know, hoping that if your client has a security that's in the news and there's some bad news around it, that your client doesn't call you or that you don't have to call the client. Like, that's not optimal from any angle, because the client is probably suffering at some level. Probably your business is going to suffer long term, because while you can hide today, that in the future that's going to come back to bite you. But now suppose there's an AI tool that tells a wealth manager, this is the market news for today. Based on what is happening, we know that maybe you should be contacting 5 of your clients because there's relevant things for them. Or these 2 clients are likely to be worried based on what's going on in the echo chamber. Or here's 4 clients who maybe will want to change their investment allocation based on what's going on in the echo chamber. So the potential is huge, not just to use the tool to make businesses like ours more efficient,
Yes.
but to actually impact the investor outcome. And I think that's where fintech can be super interesting in the interaction with news, is how do you change the investor outcome? And I don't think there's enough focus on that right now.
Stay around for our next panel. That's our focus for our next panel.
And I would add one more dimension to this, is the actual production of the news and the use of AI to produce news.
Yes.
I mean, it may sound very controversial, and if there are any journalists here, they probably would hate this, but the idea is, like, how much of the news can be systematized
Yes.
in their production versus not? Maybe that's not so bad, because maybe the part that can be systematized is not what people prefer to do. And maybe they'd rather spend their time, you know, on things that cannot be replicated.
Yes.
How much can we generate systematized news? If you're in an industry like the financial industry, there's a number of things you consume. It's very commoditized. That commoditized bit, maybe you can produce it with using AI as a formatted, readable, consumable part, and so that goes for that generalist part of the news. And then leave the specialized part for, you know, actual, you know, journalists and researchers.
Where it's edited by people.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And what about using AI to help us understand the news, understand it?
That's a tough question. I think it was partly addressed in those 2 ways, and I fully agree with these use cases that.
Yeah.
That were brought about. I think AI has a real role to play in that. You know, in a way, I mean, we're mostly focused on news coming out of companies and actual, you know, reporting from companies. But that's that's the heart of what we do, which is we're using AI and data science technology to actually bring information faster, more efficiently, bring what I would call professional intelligence, because we focus on specific topics, like using that. And I think that model, and we're also trying to go through things that can be systematized so that people are more efficient and can spend their time on what cannot be systematized, more of their time. And I think that model is a good model for the future. It's not the entire replacement of men and women by machines. It's more like the supplemental, bionic arm approach, I think, that constitutes the future of the industry.
Augmentation, yeah. So do you want
Can I
to
make one quick point?
Yeah, of course.
We have a industry in financial technology news built on the notion of trying to get investors to do something. And all the research shows that to be really successful, investors need to do less. And so can you take AI and behavioral research, for example, to get them to do that? Like, we want to work on that use case.
Can you repeat that point? That is such a great point, Kunal.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, like, we have an industry built on trying to get investors to do more.
Right.
The data says investors need to do less. They're their own worst enemies. And so can you actually reinforce that through AI? I think you can.
That's very interesting. Sjoerd?
I'm thinking about this, and I think you can actually as well, because on one hand, right, you gave an example of AI producing news. So that's Bloomberg has, for instance, the cyborg that generates news, but it's not the really qualitative content they generate, right? So it's just a composition of a couple of metrics, interest rates, and then automatically some news is generated. So I think the really qualitative news will always rely upon people. And the thing is, the change of numbers in the markets often also starts with people first. So a person buys an iPhone, the sales goes up, right? So it's simple as that. And so I think there will always be humans part of the equation. But there are certain items that computers are just better at. And I think computers are better at consuming a lot of information altogether and then only highlighting the trends or the most fundamental parts. Humans will always be better to interpret like a single qualitative news article and take a standpoint. And maybe some investors are not that good at it, so they draw the wrong conclusions. So maybe there's a bit of a cooperation needed where computers tell, hey, look, these are the developments, this is the echo chamber. As a human, you might want to dive into this, into that, and leave this. And there I think you can get an optimal mix, and maybe you can even achieve then a world where investors will do less and computers will do more.
All right, that's a great way to end this panel. So a big round of applause for our panelists here.